The trouble began on a gray Monday morning, the kind where the sky looked tired before the day had even started, when Mr. Clayton stepped into his seventh-grade math class with the stiff pride of a man who believed he owned the air he breathed. He was a white, middle-aged teacher with a polished tie and a reputation for liking his rules more than he liked his students, especially the ones he thought would never amount to anything. Most days his class dragged along with ordinary lessons and ordinary moods, but today he walked in with a kind of swagger that made the room feel smaller. The students sensed it instantly, whispering behind backpacks, wondering what storm he carried. At the third row sat Malik Johnson, a quiet black student with sharp eyes and a notebook filled with equations far beyond anything his classmates had ever seen. Malik never talked much. He preferred to observe, to think, to find patterns in silence. But Mr. Clayton never looked past Malik's hoodie, his worn sneakers, or the way he kept to himself. To the teacher, Malik was just another kid from a neighborhood the city forgot. When the bell rang and the chatter faded, Mr. Clayton tapped the board with dramatic flair. "Today," he announced, "we're going to separate the students who try from the ones who pretend." The class exchanged uneasy glances. Mr. Clayton loved dividing his students into categories, usually based on who annoyed him and who didn't. He began pacing between the desks, talking about dedication, discipline, and how life punishes people who reach above their station. His voice grew louder, sharper, until it carried a strange heat. Then he stopped in front of Malik's desk. "You," he said, pointing without hesitation. Malik lifted his eyes slowly, unsure why he was the target this time. "You like to finish your classwork fast, don't you?" Mr. Clayton continued. "You like to act like math is easy, like you're some kind of prodigy." The class chuckled nervously. Malik's cheeks burned, but he kept his voice steady. "I just like math, sir." Mr. Clayton smirked. "Well, let's see how much you like it when the stakes are real." He strode toward the whiteboard, uncapped a marker, and began scribbling symbols in tight, dense strokes. An equation far beyond middle school curriculum, a complex expression that looked like a tangled forest of variables. The students stared in confusion. Malik stared in disbelief. "This," Mr. Clayton declared, stepping aside dramatically, "is a real problem. A problem that shows who's dreaming and who's delusional." He folded his arms and looked directly at Malik. "Solve this equation, and my salary is yours." The room exploded with gasps and whispers. Malik blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Sir, what?" Mr. Clayton leaned in just enough for the class to feel the tension, but not enough for his mask of authority to slip. "You heard me. You solve it, you win my annual salary. But if you fail, you stand in front of this class and admit you've been pretending to be smart, pretending to be special, pretending that a kid like you could ever outshine a teacher like me." The hush that fell over the classroom was heavy and suffocating. Malik's pulse hammered in his ears. He knew the teacher didn't mean it. No adult would actually give up a year's pay, but the challenge wasn't about truth. It was about humiliation. Mr. Clayton wanted to shrink him. He wanted to make an example out of the quiet black kid who read college-level math books during lunch. Malik glanced at the board again. Something about the structure of the equation felt off. Not just difficult, wrong. But he couldn't voice that now. It would only fuel the teacher's mockery. "Why me?" he finally asked in a low voice. "Because," Mr. Clayton replied, "you need to learn a lesson about knowing your place." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Others looked at Malik with a mix of pity and caution, afraid to be caught on the losing side of this power struggle. Malik's throat tightened. He wanted to disappear, but something steadier than fear rose in him. An instinct, a quiet fire. "Okay," he said. "Just that. One word, small but unshaking." Mr. Clayton blinked in surprise. He'd expected resistance, excuses, maybe tears. He hadn't expected acceptance, not from Malik. Then the countdown begins. The teacher declared with theatrical pride. "You have 24 hours. Tomorrow, we'll see whether your confidence is real or just another fantasy." The bell rang, but no one moved. Malik packed his notebook slowly, feeling every stare in the room pressing down like weight on his shoulders. Mr. Clayton watched him with a superior smile, convinced he had already won. Convinced that Malik would break, stumble, or confess defeat before the next day arrived. But as Malik left the room with the equation copied into his notebook, something shifted in the space behind him. The quiet kid the teacher underestimated had accepted. A challenge meant to crush him, and somewhere deep inside, a spark had caught flame. For the first time all semester, Malik walked not like someone being cornered, but like someone preparing for a truth greater than anyone in that classroom could imagine. And Mr. Clayton, arrogant and certain of his impending victory, had no idea that his fate had already begun to unravel the moment he issued that challenge. Malik left the classroom with his notebook tight against his chest, feeling as though the hallway lights had dimmed just for him, casting long shadows that followed every uncertain step. Whispers trailed behind him, not loud enough to catch word for word, but sharp enough to sting. Some students looked at him with pity, others with disbelief, and a few with quiet resentment, as if his courage had somehow made them feel smaller. By the time he reached his locker, his mind was a storm of calculations, doubts, and fragments of the equation that seemed to rearrange themselves every time he blinked. It wasn't just hard, it was structurally confusing, almost contradictory, and the more he replayed it in his head, the more he wondered whether Mr. Clayton had written it correctly or if the teacher had created something impossible simply to trap him. Malik rode the bus home, staring out the window, while dark city blocks rolled by like silent witnesses. His neighborhood wasn't the kind where people talked about dreams or academic brilliance. Most families focused on staying safe, staying fed, staying afloat. His mother was working a late shift, as always, and his little sister hummed cartoons in the living room as he walked past, trying to keep his stress invisible. He didn't want her worry. She adored him and believed he could do anything. His mother's voice still lived in his memory, even when she wasn't home. Malik, some people will expect the bare minimum from you, not because of what you can't do, but because of what they refuse to see. Prove them wrong, but stay kind. He sat at the kitchen table, opened his notebook, and copied the equation with steady hands that didn't match the pounding of his heart. Hours passed. The overhead light buzzed softly. He worked through every path he knew: substitution, factoring, logarithmic manipulation. Yet every route looped back into contradictions. Malik pushed away from the table and rubbed his temples. It felt like trying to unlock a door that had no keyhole. Why would he do this? Malik whispered under his breath. Why give a kid a puzzle that can't be solved? But deep down he knew the answer. Mr. Clayton didn't want him to solve it. He wanted Malik to bow, to shrink, to accept the boundaries the world placed around kids like him. The thought lit something inside him, something fierce yet steady. If the equation was wrong, he would find the flaw. If it was trickery, he would expose it. And if it truly could be solved, then he would be the one who solved it. Around midnight, Malik reached for the old textbooks he'd collected from libraries, book sales, even recycling bins behind the high school. Some pages were torn, some marked up by students from years ago, but these books had been his mentors, the silent teachers who never doubted him. As he flipped through them, he began noticing discrepancies between common equation structures and the form Mr. Clayton wrote. One term in particular seemed off, as though the teacher had replaced a standard variable with something that didn't belong. Malik's breath caught slightly. He wrote the suspicious portion on scratch paper and compared it across multiple references, each time tracing the same inconsistency. "This doesn't follow the rules," he murmured, feeling clarity stir like morning light. But uncertainty returned quickly. What if I'm the one missing something? What if I'm too young to see the real pattern? His inner voice fought back, firmer this time. Or what if he made it wrong because he thinks you'll never question him? Malik inhaled deeply, settling his nerves. He wasn't just fighting an equation. He was fighting expectation, assumption, bias, forces heavier than numbers. By 2 in the morning, exhaustion blurred his focus. He rested his head on his arms and drifted in and out of shallow sleep. Each time he woke, the equation glowed in his mind like a stubborn riddle carved into stone. When the sun finally pushed its way across the rooftops, Malik sat up, eyes heavy but mind sharper than the night before. He had found enough evidence to suspect the equation was flawed. But suspicion wasn't proof. And proof was what he needed. Before leaving for school, he stood in front of the bathroom mirror, staring at his reflection. He didn't see a prodigy or a failure. He saw a kid who didn't know how to give up, even when the world expected him to. He adjusted his backpack, exhaled slowly, and whispered to himself, "Win or lose, I'm not letting him write my story." At school, the air buzzed with anticipation. Students crowded around lockers, phones out, ready to witness whatever spectacle they thought would unfold. Malik ignored the chatter, pressed through the hallway, and kept his gaze forward. When he stepped into math class, Mr. Clayton stood at the front with an overconfident smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ready for your big moment?" the teacher asked, voice dripping with condescension. Malik sat down calmly, notebook closed, posture steady. "Ready," he replied, though he didn't mean what Mr. Clayton assumed. And as the bell rang and the room filled with restless excitement, Malik realized something important. Today wasn't just about solving a problem. It was about proving that he would not be intimidated by someone who believed authority gave him the right to demean a child. The fight ahead was bigger than math. It was the fight for dignity. And Malik, quiet but unbreakable, was walking straight into it. By the time the second period bell rang, the entire school seemed to pulse with an energy Malik had never felt before. Not excitement, not curiosity, but the heavy breath of a community waiting for someone to fall. Students squeezed into the math room early, eager for front row seats to the expected humiliation, whispering in rapid bursts, as though the outcome was predetermined and only the spectacle mattered. Malik sat quietly at his desk, hands folded, listening to every heartbeat thunder like a warning drum inside his chest. He wasn't afraid of the math. He was afraid of failing in front of people who already believed he would. Mr. Clayton entered with theatrical confidence, carrying a fresh marker like a dagger meant for demonstration rather than teaching. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, pacing the front of the room, "today we witness the difference between enthusiasm and ability." A few students laughed. Others tried to hide their discomfort. Mr. Clayton tapped the whiteboard where the equation still stood from yesterday. Massive, dense, almost taunting. Malik could feel the teacher's gaze on him even before Clayton turned fully toward his desk. "Young man," the teacher declared, "today you will show your classmates what happens when someone bites off more than they can chew." Malik rose slowly, not because he wanted to, but because the rules of the moment demanded it. As he walked to the front, the room seemed to narrow, rows of desks blurring into a tunnel leading straight to the equation, waiting like a giant ready to crush him. When he reached the board, he felt countless eyes drilling into his back. He took a breath, then another. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear of the math, but from the weight of being watched by people who expected him to fail. "Go ahead," Mr. Clayton said, folding his arms, smirking in quiet triumph. Malik uncapped a marker, stared at the first line, and began tracing the variables with controlled calm. But within seconds, the same troubling contradiction he'd noticed the night before reappeared in his mind. The equation structure bent the fundamental laws of how variables should interact. Something about it didn't align with textbook logic, with mathematical truth, or with the consistency of any real solvable problem. Malik paused. Mr. Clayton stepped closer. "Is something wrong?" the teacher asked loudly, his voice floating through the classroom like a challenge. Malik swallowed hard. "Sir, this part doesn't match standard form." He pointed to a term near the center of the equation. "It doesn't follow the rules of..." Mr. Clayton cut in sharply. "So the excuses begin." The class murmured. Malik felt heat rise in his chest. "I'm not making excuses," he replied softly. "I'm saying it doesn't fit the structure of equations we learn." Clayton chuckled in a way that made Malik feel smaller than he had in years. "Of course it doesn't fit what you learn. This is real mathematics, not the toy arithmetic we do in this class." The sting was immediate. Several students looked away uncomfortably. Malik steadied his breath again. He had studied enough to know the equation wasn't impossible because he lacked skill. Something was genuinely wrong. But calling out a teacher in front of a classroom could backfire, and he knew that. Instead of arguing, he lifted the marker and began writing anyway, carefully transforming the first part using familiar techniques. His handwriting was small but deliberate, lines of logic unfolding neatly beneath his fingers. The room grew quieter as a few students leaned forward, surprised by his composure. Malik made it through the initial steps without stalling, and for the first time, whispers shifted from amusement to uneasy curiosity. Mr. Clayton's eyes narrowed. This was not the stumbling performance he had expected. Malik continued until he reached the corrupted section of the equation, then froze. "Can you continue?" Mr. Clayton asked, now with a forced casualness. Malik studied. The flawed term again, weighing the risk of speaking up. He could try forcing a solution, but that would be dishonest mathematics. Or he could say what he believed to be true, that the equation itself was broken. "Sir," he said finally, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands, "I think there's an error here. The way this variable interacts with the exponent, it violates the normal function of the formula. The structure contradicts itself." The room erupted in confused chatter. Mr. Clayton raised a hand, forcing silence. "So what you're suggesting," he said slowly, "is that I, your teacher, wrote an incorrect equation?" Malik didn't answer immediately, but something inside him, something brave, something tired of shrinking, rose to the surface. "Yes," he said quietly. The whisper rippled like a shockwave. Mr. Clayton's face tightened, the polite mask cracking. "Nonsense," he snapped. "You simply don't understand it." Malik held his ground. "I understand it enough to know when something doesn't follow the rules." For the first time, the class wasn't laughing. They were staring, caught between disbelief and awe. Mr. Clayton stepped forward, invading Malik's space. "Then prove it," he said. "Prove that you know better than the adult standing in front of you." Malik didn't flinch. He turned back to the board, underlined the inconsistent term, and began rewriting a simplified version of the equation to demonstrate the contradiction. His movements were small but confident, the kind of confidence that doesn't shout but stands firm. When he finished, he capped the marker and stepped away. The room was so silent it felt unnatural. Even the classroom clock seemed to tick more slowly. Mr. Clayton stared at the board, at the underlined term, at the structure that now undeniably exposed the flaw. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, grasping for words that would reassert his authority. "You manipulated the expression incorrectly," he insisted. "That is not the method any trained mathematician would use." Malik's eyes met his. "It's the method the rules of math require." Several students exhaled sharply, realizing the teacher had no rebuttal that didn't contradict the visible logic on the board. For the first time, Malik felt the room shift, just slightly, toward him. Not fully, not safely, but enough to recognize a crack in the wall Mr. Clayton had built around his own authority. The teacher's voice hardened. "This discussion ends now. We'll finish the evaluation tomorrow." Class dismissed. The bell rang, but no one moved immediately. They were too stunned by what they had just seen. A quiet black student challenging the authority of a teacher not with anger, but with truth. Malik gathered his things, leaving the marker behind. He didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He wasn't sure if he'd won anything at all. But as he walked out the door, he heard one voice behind him, a classmate whispering to another. What if he's right? Malik didn't turn around. He just tightened his backpack straps, stepped into the hallway, and realized that tomorrow would be bigger than a single equation. It would be the day the truth either rose or was buried. By the next morning, the entire school buzzed like a hive shaken from sleep, every hallway thick with rumors that twisted the truth into shapes designed to entertain rather than inform. Students huddled in corners, talking in low, excited voices as Malik walked past, their eyes widening as if he were some strange mixture of hero, fool, and spectacle. He could hear pieces of conversations float toward him. He told the teacher he was wrong. He's going to get suspended for disrespect. He thinks he's some genius or something. And Mr. Clayton looked mad enough to explode. Each sentence felt like a pebble thrown at his back, not heavy enough to wound, but irritating enough to remind him that the whole building watched him now. Malik tried to keep his expression calm, but something restless stirred in his stomach. Not fear, but the uneasy tension of knowing that once a rumor takes shape, truth becomes a fragile thing. When he reached his classroom, he saw students rushing to grab seats near the front, eager to witness whatever confrontation might happen next. Some didn't even bother to hide their expectations. They looked at him with that same hungry curiosity people save for fireworks or collisions. Malik took his usual seat, opened his notebook, and tried to breathe normally, but the air felt thick, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. When the door swung open and Mr. Clayton entered, the room instantly stiffened. The teacher's jaw was tight, his stride sharper than usual, and he carried not just his books but an unmistakable aura of threatened pride. He avoided looking at Malik as he set his materials down, but the tension radiating from him was too obvious to ignore. "Settle down," he snapped, even though no one was talking anymore. His tone was harsher than usual, almost trembling with controlled anger. Malik watched quietly, knowing that the smallest misstep could provoke him. The teacher pulled down the projector screen, revealing a new set of equations, longer, heavier, layered with symbols that stretched like endless scaffolding across the screen. Gasps rippled through the classroom. Since yesterday's discussion led to confusion, Mr. Clayton said, forcing the word through clenched teeth, I have prepared additional problems. We will determine whether someone truly understands advanced concepts or merely believes they do. His eyes briefly flicked to Malik, sharp as broken glass. Malik felt his heartbeat quicken, but he kept still. He knew better than to react. We will conduct a formal demonstration tomorrow, the teacher announced. A timed assessment, in front of the class, to evaluate comprehension. More whispers. A boy in the back muttered, he's gonna destroy him, earning nervous laughter from his friends. Malik swallowed hard, but internally he steadied himself. This wasn't about math anymore. It was about control, about authority, about whether a student had the right to question an adult when the adult was wrong. Mr. Clayton moved through the lesson with abrupt, rigid energy, his explanations rushed and messy, as if he were distracted by the shadow of Malik's challenge. At one point he asked a question, and no one dared raise a hand, afraid to be caught in the crossfire. After class, Malik lingered to gather his things more slowly, hoping the crowd would thin before he entered the hallway of hungry stares. But as he slid his notebook into his bag, he sensed someone approaching. It wasn't a student. It was Ms. Ramirez, the assistant principal, with worry lining her face. Malik, she said gently, can I talk to you for a moment? He nodded, and she stepped aside so they could speak quietly. Honey, she continued, lowering her voice, I've heard what happened yesterday. Mr. Clayton reported that you challenged him in a way he considered disrespectful. Malik opened his mouth, but she held up a hand. I'm not accusing you of anything. I just need to understand your side. Malik explained slowly, how he noticed inconsistencies, how he wasn't trying to embarrass the teacher, how he simply answered truthfully when asked. Ms. Ramirez listened carefully, her brow furrowing deeper with each detail. I see, she murmured at last. Thank you for telling me. You did the right thing by staying respectful. Then she sighed, glancing toward the hallway as though weighing something heavy. Sometimes adults don't handle being questioned very well, even when the student is right. I'll keep an eye on the situation. Malik felt a small wave of gratitude, though he knew her support might not be enough to stop what Mr. Clayton was building. When she left, Malik stood alone for a moment, staring at the empty desks and the faint traces of equations still smudged across the board. He wasn't afraid of the math. They were just numbers, rules, truths waiting to be shaped. But he was afraid of the power that came with being right when someone who held authority desperately needed him to be wrong. At lunch, he sat alone as usual, nibbling at a sandwich he barely tasted. Students kept sneaking glances at him, some curious, some amused, some clearly irritated that he'd made their favorite teacher look foolish. A few kids deliberately walked past his table, whispering loudly enough for him to hear. He asked for it, one girl muttered. Why would he pick a fight he can't win? He should have just stayed quiet, her friend replied. Malik pressed his fingers against his temple, trying to drown out the noise. He wasn't trying to fight anyone. He never wanted this attention. He only cared about truth, numbers that followed rules, equations that made sense, a world that matched logic even when people didn't. That evening at home, he sat at the kitchen table again, studying the original equation and the new ones Mr. Clayton had shown the class. The more he examined them, the more clearly he saw patterns that contradicted themselves, symbols that didn't belong, variables arranged in ways that defied foundational principles. It wasn't just one mistake. There were several. Malik pressed his pencil to the page and whispered under his breath. He doesn't want a solution. He wants proof that I don't deserve to question him. But he kept working anyway, methodically, carefully, breaking each cluster of symbols into smaller logic paths until their contradictions glared back like warning lights. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. passed. Still he worked. And somewhere around 2 in the morning, he realized something important. Something that didn't scare him, but changed the way he saw the entire situation. The equation wasn't wrong by accident. It was wrong by design. A trap. A test he wasn't supposed to pass. Malik sat back, heart pounding, with a mix of anger and clarity. Tomorrow wasn't just a demonstration. It was an attempt to break him publicly. But Malik wasn't planning to crumble. He wasn't planning to run. He wasn't planning to accept anyone's version of truth except the one he could prove. As he closed his notebook, he whispered to himself with quiet certainty, "If he wants a show, I'll give one. But it won't end the way he thinks." By the time Friday morning arrived, the school felt like it had transformed into an arena. Every hallway buzzing with anticipation, every locker conversation orbiting around one name, Malik. The rumors had expanded into wild stories, each more exaggerated than the last, with some students claiming Malik had shouted at Mr. Clayton, others insisting he had slammed his notebook down in defiance, and a few even claiming the principal was preparing to suspend him for challenging authority. Malik heard pieces of these lies float around him as he walked through the crowded corridor, but he kept moving with steady strides, refusing to let anyone see how much their whispers poked at his confidence. He wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of being turned into a symbol when all he wanted was honesty. Tired of adults twisting truth to protect pride. Tired of classmates who chose spectacle over empathy. As he stepped into the math classroom, he immediately sensed the tension coiled in the air like a tightened rope. Mr. Clayton stood at the front, posture rigid, every movement sharp and stiff. He wore a pressed shirt and a gleaming tie, but despite his polished appearance, something in his expression looked frayed, as if the weight of maintaining control had begun cracking the edges of his composure. On the whiteboard behind him, 3 massive equations stretched from one end to the other, new ones, far more complex and intentionally intimidating. Malik felt a shiver run through him. These weren't ordinary problems. They were crafted to overwhelm, to ensure no middle school student could possibly keep up. A few classmates gasped as they read the symbols. Others looked at Malik with something sharp and victorious in their eyes, as if they expected him to crumble before the challenge even began. Mr. Clayton cleared his throat, drawing the room to attention. "For the sake of fairness," he announced, voice stiff with a rehearsed calm, "today's demonstration will take place with full transparency. Malik will attempt these problems while the class observes." He turned toward Malik with a tight smile that dripped superiority. "We will see whether his claims of flawed equations hold up under real academic scrutiny." Malik inhaled slowly, letting the air steady him. "I never claimed I was better than anyone," he said quietly. "I just said the equation didn't follow the rules." A few students exchanged glances, surprised by the calm clarity in his voice. Mr. Clayton's smile vanished, replaced by something harder. "Proceed," he ordered, gesturing toward the board as if summoning a performer to a stage. Malik walked forward, feeling the weight of 30 pairs of eyes settle on him like invisible chains. He reached for a marker and studied the equations one more time. His heart thudded, his palms damp with nerves, but his mind sharpened with each passing second. He broke the first equation into smaller segments, rewriting it step by step, just as he had practiced. The room fell silent. Even students who normally distracted themselves with doodles or whispers leaned forward, watching him with curiosity they couldn't hide. Malik's handwriting moved steadily across the board, unraveling the first steps with careful logic. For a brief moment, it felt like the room paused, suspended in collective breath, surprised by how calmly he worked through something that looked impossible. But the moment he reached the midpoint of the equation, he stopped. The inconsistency was glaring, an exponent that inverted a variable in a way no coherent formula would ever allow. Malik stepped aside and circled the problematic section. "This part," he said, voice steady but firm, "violates the structure of the pattern. It creates an impossible condition." A ripple of confusion spread through the classroom. Mr. Clayton's jaw clenched. "Incorrect," he snapped. "You simply lack the knowledge to understand that variation." Malik lifted his chin slightly, not in defiance, but in truth. "No, sir," he replied. "I checked last night. This form contradicts the base rules of the expression." He wrote a simplified version beneath it to show the inconsistency. The students leaned forward even more now, watching the contradiction crystallize in real time. A few murmured quietly. They weren't math experts, but they could see the logic laid out in front of them. Mr. Clayton's face tightened further. "You are misinterpreting it," he insisted. "This is an advanced structure. You wouldn't know how to read it." Malik met his eyes again. "Then why does it break the rule that all textbooks agree on?" Silence. Heavy, stunned, revealing silence. Someone in the back whispered, "He's right. "It doesn't match." Another murmured, "Why would the teacher write it wrong?" Mr. Clayton froze, hearing the shift he feared most, the shift in perception, the erosion of the authority he had relied on to silence students. His voice trembled slightly when he spoke again. "We're done with this discussion." But Malik wasn't challenging him with attitude. He was challenging him with clarity. "Sir," he said softly, "you asked me to solve it. I can't solve something that contradicts itself. That's not disrespect." His voice grew stronger. "That's the truth." A hush fell over the room, so thick it felt like the air held its breath. Mr. Clayton's eyes flicked from the equation to Malik to the faces of the students, all watching him closely, not with fear, but with a new awareness. Something inside him cracked visibly. The tight facade he had maintained throughout the week finally faltered. His voice, when he spoke, came out strained. "Take your seat." Malik returned to his desk, his pulse still racing, but something inside him had shifted, the quiet understanding that he no longer needed to be afraid of being right. And as he sat down, he saw the way the class looked at him now. Not like a spectacle, not like a fool walking into a trap, but like someone who had dared to speak the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. The bell rang moments later, sharp and startling, but no one moved at first. They simply watched Malik pack his things with steady hands, a boy who had refused to be crushed by intimidation. As he stepped out into the hallway, he felt an unfamiliar strength settle in his chest, a spark that foretold that everything was about to change. Not because he wanted to fight, but because the truth had already begun to shine through cracks no one could hide anymore. The following Monday, the school felt different the moment Malik stepped through the front doors, as if the entire building hummed with the uneasy awareness that something important had shifted, something that could no longer be pushed back into silence. Whispers still trailed behind him, but they carried a strange new tone, an unexpected mixture of respect, curiosity, and hesitant admiration. Students still stared, but now their gazes lingered not with mockery, but with the quiet recognition that he had done something most kids would never dare. He had stood up for truth without shouting, without anger, without trying to humiliate anyone. Malik walked with steady steps toward class, though his stomach tightened with nerves for whatever awaited him. He didn't know whether Mr. Clayton would retaliate, apologize, ignore the issue, or twist it into something entirely different. All he knew was that he would not shrink, not after everything. When he entered the room, he noticed instantly that the whiteboard was clean. No impossible equations. No traps disguised as lessons. Just an empty surface, stark and silent. Mr. Clayton stood at his desk, shoulders tense, eyes lowered as he sorted papers with stiff movements. Malik took his seat quietly, watching him with caution. The room gradually filled with students, the usual chatter subdued, as if everyone sensed the tension beneath the surface and chose not to poke at it. When the bell rang, Mr. Clayton cleared his throat, but the sound wobbled slightly, betraying the confidence he was trying to maintain. "Class," he began, avoiding eye contact with everyone. "Before we start today's lesson, I need to address something from last week." The room froze. Every student turned toward him, breaths caught in suspense. Even Malik felt his pulse quicken. The teacher paused for a moment, gripping the edge of his desk as though steadying himself. "On Friday," he continued, "I presented equations that were not appropriate for the grade level." A quiet ripple moved through the students, half shock, half disbelief. Mr. Clayton swallowed hard. "Upon reviewing them over the weekend, I realized that several contained structural inconsistencies. They were not solvable in the way I intended." Another ripple, louder now. Some students glanced at Malik with wide eyes. A few whispered, "He's admitting it." Malik's breath caught in his chest. For a moment, he wondered whether he was dreaming. Mr. Clayton finally raised his gaze, but his eyes wavered, conflicted between pride and responsibility. "In my frustration," he went on, voice tightening, "I created an environment where a student was made to feel targeted. That was unfair, and it was wrong." Silence wrapped the room like a blanket. It felt unreal, like watching a wall that had stood for years finally crack under the weight of truth. Malik didn't move. He barely blinked. Then, slowly, Mr. Clayton turned to him. "Malik," he said, "you were right to point out the inconsistency, and you handled yourself with more composure than most adults I know." A stunned murmur swept through the classroom. Malik felt heat rise behind his eyes. Not sadness, not relief, but a profound sense of justice finally allowed to breathe. He nodded quietly, unable to trust his voice. Mr. Clayton exhaled sharply, as though surrendering a battle he had never needed to fight. I allowed my pride to guide my decisions. That should never happen in a classroom. And I apologize. The words felt heavy, not because they were dramatic, but because they were real, raw, unexpected, human. The class remained frozen in shock. No one had ever heard Mr. Clayton apologize for anything, much less to a student. When he turned back to the board and began writing out a new, grade-appropriate lesson, the room felt subtly transformed. The authority he carried no longer came from fear or intimidation, but from something more fragile and more genuine: humility. Malik spent the lesson listening quietly, absorbing every detail, not because he needed the material, but because he sensed the importance of letting this moment settle without bitterness. When the bell rang and students poured into the hallway, buzzing with disbelief, Malik lingered at his desk, packing up slowly. As he turned to leave, he heard footsteps behind him. "Malik," Mr. Clayton said, voice low but steady. Malik turned, meeting his eyes. For the first time, the teacher looked not like a towering authority, but like a person, flawed, learning, trying. "I've recommended you for the Advanced Mathematics Enrichment Program," he said. "You should have been placed there already." "That's on me." Malik blinked. For a moment he couldn't speak. "Thank you, sir," he finally managed, his voice soft but unmistakably strong. Mr. Clayton nodded once, a quiet gesture of respect Malik had never imagined he'd receive. "Keep questioning things," he said. "That's what real mathematicians do." As Malik walked into the hallway, he felt something inside him settle into place. Not triumph, not victory, but the affirmation that truth, even when whispered, can change people. Students parted slightly as he passed, not out of fear, but out of acknowledgement. Some offered small nods. Others whispered things like, "That was brave," or "You proved him wrong the right way." And Malik, with his notebook hugged close, realized something powerful. He hadn't embarrassed a teacher. He hadn't won a fight. He hadn't sought revenge. He had simply insisted on honesty in a world where honesty is often uncomfortable. And in doing so, he had earned something no challenge could promise: respect he didn't have to demand. As he pushed open the school doors and stepped into the sunlight, he whispered to himself, "Math doesn't lie. And neither do I." The day felt new, clear, balanced, like an equation finally brought into harmony. And for the first time in a long time, Malik felt not small or underestimated or cornered, but exactly what he truly was: a young mind with infinite potential, walking confidently toward whatever future awaited him next.